The stars outside the ship blinked in silent apathy, distant and cold, as Commander Alaric Holt made his rounds through the dim corridors of the Erebus. In the sterile stillness of the ship, his footsteps echoed, a solitary sound that emphasized the isolation rather than dispelling it. Alaric had spent most of his life in space or preparing to be in it, but nothing, not the years of training, the hours of psychological conditioning, or the camaraderie of his crew, had prepared him for this strange, hollow feeling, a sensation that crept in like frost on a winter morning. It started as a small, unremarkable lapse. Standing in front of the mess hall, Alaric struggled to recall the name of his favorite childhood dog. He remembered the feel of the dog's fur, the warmth of its body as it slept by his side. But the name? It floated just beyond his grasp, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He shook his head, dismissing it. They were in deep space. It was natural for memories to slip, he reasoned. They were just fragments, inconsequential details. But as the days passed, these inconsequential details began to pile up. In the common area, Alaric would catch snippets of conversations between his crewmates, fragments of confessions and shared worries about forgotten birthdays, lost phone numbers, faces they could no longer recall. Engineer Mikhail Kravchenko joked that his mind was slipping from space madness, that all the long years spent in the vacuum had finally corroded his memory. The crew laughed, their laughter filling the metallic walls of the ship with a hollow cheerfulness, but beneath it was a tangible unease, a feeling of something slipping, just out of sight. Then, one morning, Dr. Liana Keller, the mission's psychologist, called a meeting in the medbay. Her face, usually calm and collected, was drawn and pale, and Alaric noticed a tremor in her hands as she clutched her data pad. When the crew gathered, she scanned their faces, hesitating before she spoke. "I want to address something," Liana said, her voice wavering. "Have any of you been losing memories?" The crew exchanged nervous glances. Lieutenant Farah Cho, a sharp and confident navigator, crossed her arms defensively, her expression guarded. "What do you mean by losing memories?" Liana cleared her throat, struggling to find the right words. It's like my life before this mission is slipping away. Just yesterday, I was trying to remember my wedding day, and it was hazy. It's like I remember the idea of it, but not the details." Mikhail shook his head, skeptical. "We've all been under pressure. Long stints in space can mess with the brain. They teach us that in basic training." "Yes, I know," Liana replied, her tone turning sharp. "But this isn't stress. It's like something is being erased, and it's happening faster than I can explain." Alaric frowned, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. As he sat silently, he tried to remember his own wedding day, his wife's face, the sound of her laugh. The images were there, but muted, dimmed like a faded photograph. He clenched his fists, unwilling to voice his fears, but as he looked at the others, he saw the same worry etched on their faces. "It's more than memories," Farah whispered, her voice breaking. I feel like pieces of me are missing. Not just the memories, but the emotions attached to them. Like I'm hollow." Silence hung heavy in the room. They all felt it, an invisible weight pressing down, a dread gnawing at the edges of their minds. Alaric finally broke the silence, his tone hardened by command. "We're going to keep records," he said, "starting now. Everyone will write down what they remember. It'll be our way of keeping track of ourselves, of staying tethered. They spent hours that night, each alone, pouring memories onto pages, documenting details from their lives on Earth. Family names, childhood homes, favorite foods, even favorite colors. But as they wrote, a growing sense of detachment seeped into their minds, like they were documenting the lives of strangers. Alaric wrote about his family, his father's booming laugh, the way his sister used to sneak out in the middle of the night. Yet the more he wrote, the less he recognized the words. Each sentence felt like an artifact, something relic-like and alien, as if it belonged to another time, another person. Liana collected their entries the next day and secured them in the ship's archive. She assigned a daily recording session, an attempt to grasp what remained of their identities. Days stretched on, each one more disorienting than the last, as their personal histories blurred and fragmented. They began questioning one another, doubting the authenticity of each other's stories. Mikhail accused Farah of forgetting on purpose, of using her vanishing memories as an excuse to shirk responsibilities. Farah, in turn, avoided Mikhail, whispering to Liana that she didn't trust him, that he was acting like a stranger. The rifts grew deeper, paranoia gnawing at the fabric of their relationships, each of them feeling more alone. Alaric spent his sleepless nights pacing the corridors, his mind replaying fractured scenes of a life he no longer recognized. He could remember Earth as a hazy, distant orb, a pale blue dot swallowed by the void, but the scent of rain, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of wind through the trees, these things, once vibrant, were now beyond reach. It was then that the biological scans came back. Liana's voice trembled over the intercom as she summoned everyone to the medbay. They gathered, eyes hollow, shoulders hunched, each one visibly diminished by the weight of their silent fears. Liana held up the holographic scan, revealing dark patches scattered across their brain scans. Dead zones, as she called them. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, her voice breaking. "There's no physiological reason for this kind of rapid memory degradation. It's like parts of our brains are shutting down." "But we're physically fine, right?" Mikhail demanded, his voice tinged with desperation. "This has to be psychological, stress-induced. There has to be a way to reverse it." Liana shook her head. "It's not psychological. Whatever this is, it's spreading." The crew was left in stunned silence, a suffocating dread filling the room as the reality of their situation sank in. Alaric looked around, seeing not his comrades, not his friends, but hollowed versions of themselves, shadows stripped of warmth and familiarity. "We're going to record everything," he said, voice low but resolute. "Every day, every change. We're going to hold on to who we are, whatever is happening to us. We won't let it win." But in his heart, a doubt festered, a silent terror he dared not voice. Because in the emptiness of space, among the unblinking stars, something had begun to unravel them. It was as if the void itself was pulling at their minds, claiming pieces of their souls. And with each passing day, their grip on themselves slipped, their memories fading like echoes swallowed by the dark. Alaric Holt stared at his own reflection in the dimly lit mirror of his quarters. He looked gaunt, the hollows under his eyes shadowed and deep. His face, once so familiar, felt like a mask stretched over his skull, foreign and somehow wrong. He rubbed his temples, but the ache wouldn't go away. This memory loss was no longer just lapses or small, forgettable things. His very sense of self was fraying. And it wasn't just him. His entire crew was crumbling from within. Reports from the rest of the crew were growing more desperate. Every day, someone mentioned new gaps in their lives, details of childhoods and friendships slipping away. They no longer trusted each other's memories, or even their own. Liana, usually composed and rational, was reduced to tearful breakdowns. Mikhail's skepticism had turned to silent rage, and Farah's once confident demeanor had become cautious, her eyes darting at every noise, every flicker of light. They'd started to splinter into factions of one, each person suspicious of the others. Mikhail had been the first to raise suspicions about the ship itself. "Logs are going missing," he said one evening, his voice a low growl. The crew sat gathered around the dimly lit table in the mess hall, their eyes hollow and bloodshot, their hands fidgeting as if they could feel something crawling beneath their skin. "There are maintenance entries I never wrote, repairs that none of us remember making. The ship, it's changing. Someone's tampering with it. Maybe it's one of us." His gaze lingered on Farah, whose face twisted in confusion and disgust. "Why would I sabotage the ship?" she snapped, her tone defensive. "I'm the navigator. If something goes wrong, I'm the one who gets us home." But Alaric sensed a deeper unease brewing in Mikhail's words. It wasn't just distrust. It was a primal fear, something rooted in his core. Alaric had seen that look before, in soldiers who sensed they were being hunted. He decided to investigate the logs himself, hoping to disprove Mikhail's theories. They didn't need more paranoia infecting the crew. But what he found unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The maintenance logs revealed discrepancies. There were entries for repairs to ventilation ducts, coolant systems, and life support adjustments that no one could account for. Even stranger, the timestamps on these logs corresponded with hours when the crew had been together, confirming none of them could have completed these tasks. His stomach churned as he flipped through the data. It was like someone or something was moving within the ship's systems, attending to it in the dead of night, just out of their sight. Alaric decided to place small cameras in the engineering crawl spaces and ventilation ducts, hoping to catch something that would explain the tampering. They were simple devices, barely noticeable and triggered by movement, and he set them up alone, waiting until the others were asleep. But the next morning, when he reviewed the footage, it was blank. There wasn't static or missing data. The recordings showed nothing but empty corridors and still air. Frustrated, Alaric checked the equipment, but everything was in perfect working order. It didn't make sense. He'd felt so sure that something was lurking on the Erebus, hiding just outside their field of view, slipping through the shadows like a phantom. The real breakthrough came later that day, though it was nothing they had anticipated. Mikhail had been dispatched to fix a coolant leak in one of the narrow crawl spaces. These passages were narrow and confining, meant only for repairs and emergency access. Alaric kept an ear on the radio as Mikhail moved through the dark confines of the ship, his gruff voice reporting his progress, the occasional hiss of frustration punctuating the airwaves. Suddenly, there was silence. "Mikhail," Alaric called over the intercom, but the line remained static. He felt a pang of dread as the silence stretched on. Then finally, a gasp, ragged and fearful, came through the speaker. "Commander," Mikhail's voice was a hoarse whisper, tinged with something Alaric had never heard from the engineer before, terror. "There's something down here." "What do you mean, something?" Alaric asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's like a shadow, but it's not. I felt it brush against me, slick like wet flesh." Mikhail's breathing grew rapid, panicked. It slid away before I could see it, but it left something on my arm. Alaric's stomach twisted as he motioned for Farah and Liana to join him. Together, they hurried to the crawl space, meeting a visibly shaken Mikhail as he emerged. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, and his left arm was covered in a thin, glistening film that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The skin beneath was irritated, raw red blotches forming along his forearm. "Get him to the med bay," Alaric ordered, his voice gruff. But his mind was racing with questions, an undercurrent of fear bubbling just below the surface. Liana examined the substance under the microscope, but what she saw defied classification. It wasn't human, and it wasn't microbial either. The cells looked both familiar and alien, strands of DNA coiled around something darker, their structure filled with dense filaments, each one vibrating with a strange, rhythmic pulse. "It's organic," she murmured, barely audible. "Some kind of parasite, but I've never seen anything like it." Mikhail's condition deteriorated rapidly. Within hours, he was feverish, his body racked with violent spasms. He clawed at his skin, insisting that something was burrowing beneath it. Alaric restrained him, his heart pounding as Mikhail writhed on the table, desperate to remove the unseen invader. But as they examined him, they noticed something even more disturbing. Raised patterns were beginning to form beneath his skin, intricate and unnatural, like veins swollen with ink, twisting and pulsing in response to some invisible rhythm. "Get it out," Mikhail begged, his voice cracking. "Please, get it out." But Liana didn't know where to start. The organism had embedded itself so deeply, its tendrils woven into Mikhail's veins and nerves. And as they watched, horrified, his face contorted, his eyes glazing over as if he was slipping away, no longer aware of their presence. Alaric looked at Liana, her face ashen with dread. "This isn't just a parasite," she whispered. It's trying to merge with him." Days passed in a haze of uncertainty and horror. The other crew members began reporting strange sensations, tingling in their limbs, shadows in their peripheral vision, a coldness in the air that seemed to follow them. Alaric noticed Farah scratching at her arms, her face lined with fear as she described feeling something crawling under the skin. "Just under the surface," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear, "moving like it's searching for something." One by one, the symptoms spread. Each of them began to feel the presence, an unrelenting sensation of being watched, of something lurking behind them in every empty corridor. But what unsettled Alaric most were the subtle shifts in their personalities. Farah grew withdrawn, her eyes dull, as though she were becoming someone else. Liana, once rational and collected, spoke in whispers to herself, as if afraid her own thoughts weren't safe. Alaric himself felt it, a gnawing sensation at the base of his spine, a whispering intrusion creeping into his mind, his memories, the memories he had tried so desperately to document and preserve, felt fractured. Flashes of alien landscapes, strange sounds, and a sense of dread seeped into his consciousness. He couldn't tell if these were fragments of his own life or something else entirely, something planted there. The only truth that remained was the sense of invasion, the understanding that whatever this organism was, it wasn't merely infecting them. It was consuming them piece by piece. It was infiltrating their minds, their memories, pulling them into something larger, something they couldn't escape. One night, as he sat alone in the observation deck, staring into the void, Alaric felt a chill. He glanced over his shoulder and for a split second saw something. A shadow, indistinct and pulsing, a glimpse of a creature that could be anywhere, everywhere within the walls within his mind. It moved with a rhythmic pulse, a silent beat that echoed deep within his chest, as if it were calling him, drawing him deeper into its reach. And then it was gone, leaving only the dark, oppressive silence of space. Continuation of the story coming soon.